They say hell rode into Bitter Mesa that day, but the devil didn't reckon on one man. The desert around Bitter Mesa drank in the last light of day like an old drunk swallowing his final shot. Long shadows stretched from the jagged red canyons, falling over the dusty trails and bone-dry arroyos like creeping fingers. The wind came low and slow, whistling through the brush and kicking up swirls of sand that danced like ghosts across the plains. The kind of wind that made horses nervous, the kind that carried stories. The folks in Bitter Mesa didn't talk much about what happened that summer, but when they did, usually after 3 whiskeys and just before closing time, they'd speak of the old man out at Dry Rock Hollow, the one who walked into hell and came out dragging the devil's hide behind him. His name was Silas McCrae. Folks called him Dust. Nobody ever said it to his face, not because he was mean, but because he had that look, like a thunderhead just barely holding back its lightning. He wasn't tall, nor loud, and he never bragged like the younger men did, but they all knew what he'd done in the old days, out past the San Pedro line, in those shadowy Apache hills. When the U.S. government didn't want to admit they needed someone, they sent Dust. He'd put that life down 10 years ago, married Rosa in '79, built her a homestead from cedar and sweat, and planted an orchard that never quite took. She was a firebrand, dark-haired and sharp-tongued, with a laugh that could bring color back to a dying man's face. She'd come up from Sonora to teach the ranch kids letters and morals. Ended up staying for the only man who didn't leer when she spoke. They were quiet folk, just 2 souls trying to make a life where the land didn't want one. That summer, Dust spent most days fixing fences or checking the well. The rains hadn't come right, and the earth was cracked like a broken skillet. Rosa taught school twice a week in town, then rode back before sundown, always in that red shawl he'd given her the winter they married. But the quiet wasn't built to last. Not in the frontier. It was just past noon when the telegram came. Dust was at the general store in Bitter Mesa, trading dried beans for flour. Henry Coyle, the telegraph man, called him over with a face like curdled milk. Dust read the message once, then again. No emotion passed over his face, just a tightening of the jaw and a slight flare of the nostrils. Crow spotted heading south. Burned out 2 ranches near Canyon Red. Took 4 women. Possible route toward Rio Frio. No cavalry response confirmed. Crows. That name hadn't been spoken in years. Not since the border wars. Vultures and spurs, every last one. They didn't just kill. They left people wishing they'd been killed. Dust folded the telegram, nodded to Henry, and walked out without a word. By supper, he was sharpening his old skinning knife, the one with the bone handle and notches carved into the grip. Rosa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. "I know that look," she said. Her accent curled around the words like smoke. "You're digging up ghosts again." "Not if they stay dead," Dust replied. "You think they're coming? I know they're close, and I know the sheriff won't lift a finger." Rosa said nothing for a moment. Then she walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll pack the rifle, just in case." That night, the wind blew harder than usual. The shutters rattled like dice in a gambler's hand, and the coyotes howled far too early. Dust sat by the fire, one hand on his coffee, the other resting on the old Colt that hadn't seen daylight in 5 years. Rosa read from her Bible, lips moving silently, the firelight casting gold across her cheek. Far beyond their homestead, atop the canyon rim, a silhouette watched. Motionless, patient. A man on horseback. He sat in stillness as the firelight flickered through the distant window. Then slowly, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, his horse silent beneath him. In town, the sheriff drank himself to sleep. The cavalry was 3 days north. The neighbors were miles apart and already boarding up. But Dust and Rosa, they slept light. They had lived through worse, or at least they thought they had, because evil was riding down through Bitter Mesa, and this time it had names. The sun hadn't even cracked the horizon when the crows came riding in. 13 of them stretched out in a crooked line across the hardpan, their horses kicking up long trails of dust. The lead rider, tall, straight-backed, and dressed in a black coat that fluttered like wings, moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew no one would stop him. That was Luther Kane. His face was thin and leathery, with cheeks like sun-bleached parchment and lips that barely moved when he spoke. His eyes, cold, obsidian black, didn't blink, didn't flinch, and didn't care much what they looked at. They'd seen every manner of evil and done worse. The stories told in backwater saloons about Luther Kane didn't come close to the truth. And the truth was this: when he rode up to your door, he already owned everything you were too afraid to protect. Dust stood at the edge of his porch, arms folded, legs apart, not moving. His Winchester leaned against the post, within reach but not yet in hand. Kane raised a hand, and the gang stopped a dozen paces from the fence line. "Mornin'," Kane said, like he was tipping his hat at Sunday service. Dust didn't answer. Kane smiled. "Don't suppose a man might ask for a drink. The boys and I've been riding hard out of Black Hollow. Dusty work." Dust said nothing. His face was calm, unreadable. Behind him, Rosa stepped into view. She wore her red shawl, the one she kept for days, when she wanted to feel brave. Kane's gaze shifted to her and stayed there. His smile faded to something slower, something hungrier. "Well now," he said, "ain't that a sight? You don't see that kind of beauty much out here. Mexico way, maybe, but not in this desert." Rosa held his gaze, lips pressed tight. Her hands didn't shake. Kane leaned forward in his saddle, resting one hand on the horn. "What's she doing out here with a wrinkled-up ghost like you, McCrae?" Dust's eyes narrowed. "You know my name." "Course I do. I remember what you did to Renner's boys. Heard they found M hung upside down from the canyon wall, eyes gone. Only a man like you could get away with that and still sleep." Kane's voice dropped, slick with amusement. "But I don't hold grudges. I'm a businessman now." Rosa stepped closer to Dust. Kane saw it. "I'll give you 5 gold eagles for her," Kane said. "Double that if she smiles for me." Rosa spat. It landed in the dust beside Kane's boot. She didn't say a word. Kane's grin cracked wide. He laughed once, short and sharp, then turned his horse. "No offense meant," he called. "Just paying respects. We'll be on our way. Fine morning to you both." They rode off slow, not in a hurry, their horses trotting in that relaxed way that said we'll be back when it suits us. Dust didn't move until they were out of sight. Rosa gripped his arm tight. "They'll come back," she said. "I know," he replied. By evening, Dust decided to ride into Bitter Mesa for supplies. He needed salt, nails, and tobacco, but mostly, he needed to talk to the telegraph man again. If Kane was moving south, there was a chance other towns were being hit. He left Rosa with a shotgun, and she kissed him once, hard on the cheek. "If I see them," she said, "I'll shoot first." "You won't need to," Dust promised. But he wasn't sure. It was a 6-hour ride there and back. He made it to town in under 2, moved like a ghost through the store, and left without even a cup of coffee. On the way home, the sky began to glow with a low orange hue. He thought it was the sunset, but it wasn't. The smell hit him a mile out. Burnt cedar, horsehair, blood. His horse whinnied, ears laid flat. Dust kicked it into a gallop. The house was half gone. Flames still licked the charred beams. The roof collapsed in the middle. The orchard was trampled flat, fruit smashed and rotting. Blood streaked the fence rail and pooled near the porch. And there, fluttering in the wind like a dying bird, was Rosa's red shawl, nailed to the front post with a skinning knife. Dust dismounted without a word. His hands didn't tremble. He walked into the ruins, past the smoking doorway, past the bed that was now cinders. He found the shotgun empty, and the overturned chair where Rosa must have fought. There were footprints, boot prints, hoof marks, drag marks. They hadn't killed her. They took her, and that Dust knew was a mistake. He stood there in the smoldering dusk, ash falling like snow around him. Then he picked up the shawl, folded it once, and tucked it inside his coat. He took the knife, too. The next morning, he walked into Bitter Mesa as the town stirred to life. No horse, no hat, no coat. Just a canteen, a 12-gauge slung on his back, and a name burning behind his eyes. "Kane," he said to the telegraph man. Henry Coyle looked up from his desk. His eyes went wide when he saw Dust's face. "You want me to send a wire?" Henry asked. Dust shook his head. Won't be necessary. What are you gonna do? Dust looked past him, out the window, where the sun was already turning the desert into flame. Finish what they started. No one in town tried to stop him. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, not even the gun hands who normally didn't care which side of the law they worked. They just watched him walk south, into the heat, into the open maw of vengeance. Because they knew. Dust McCrae wasn't looking to bring Rosa home. He was looking to bury the world between them. The desert doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. Dust moved through it like a man returning to something that had been waiting for him all along. He left bitter Mesa without saying a word, save for the name Luther Kane. No one asked questions. Those who saw his eyes knew answers wouldn't help. The wind blew hot from the south, carrying the faint scent of creosote and blood. It was a dry heat, one that cracked your lips and pulled the sweat straight from your bones. But Dust rode through it without pause. He followed the tracks. They were easy to read at first, 13 sets of hooves, spaced for a hard push. The crows were riding fast, but not panicked. That told Dust they thought they were safe, that they'd gotten away with it. 3 miles out of town, he found the first camp. Burnt embers still warm, bones in the fire, blackened and cracked. Not animal bones. A shoe, half melted, lay off to the side. A small one, maybe a child's. He said nothing, just took the embers in with his eyes and moved on. By the second day, the heat was blistering. His canteen ran dry before sundown. He found water in a stagnant puddle behind a crumbled outcrop. He drank it without flinching. You had to understand the land to live in it. And Dust knew this desert better than most men knew their own kin. On the third day, he came upon a boy. The child was sitting alone by the husk of a wagon, staring at nothing with clouded eyes. His face was sunburnt raw, lips cracked, flies buzzing around his mouth. Dust dismounted, knelt beside him. "You blind?" The boy turned toward the voice. "They lit the fire after they tied me. Smoke took the eyes." "Crows." The boy nodded. They was laughing. One of them had a scar like a horseshoe under his ear. "Took my sister." Dust gave the boy water, left him under shade, and marked the horseshoe scar in his mind like a nail in a coffin. That night, he dreamed of Rosa, her laugh echoing like wind chimes in the canyon. But the dream turned. The laugh became a scream. Then silence. He woke before dawn, hand already gripping the knife, by instinct. By the 5th day, the crow's trail crossed through a burned-out ranch at Dry Needle Creek. The land was scorched black. Buzzards circled overhead. Among the ashes, a man sat propped against a fence post, shirtless, skin blistered, breath shallow. "Help," the man croaked. Dust gave him water. The man coughed violently, then groaned. They lit it for sport. Said they liked to watch things dance. "They took my wife. Said she was too pretty to die yet." Dust looked past him, to the distant hills. "Which way?" "South. Toward Lobo Canyon. You'll smell their smoke." Dust left him with a blanket and his last strip of jerky. The land began to shift, more stone now, less brush. Narrow canyons with high walls, shadows long and cool. But they didn't comfort. These were ambush lands, places where men vanished. He started moving at night. His eyes adjusted fast. Every hoofprint, every crushed blade of grass, every broken cactus told a story. The crows didn't hide their trail. They didn't think anyone would follow. They were wrong. The further Dust rode, the more the past caught up to him. He remembered Veracruz, the salt marshes, the hanging trees, the screams. They'd sent him there when the marsh bandits had taken over the rail camps. Nobody else would go. Before that, the Black Hill Massacre. 30 men dead in a canyon, one survivor found with a single bullet hole in his head. Dust had pulled the trigger. Cold justice, they called it. Some whispered butcher. He remembered every man he killed, and everyone he spared. He left that life behind when he met Rosa. Buried the badge, buried the revolver, buried the rage. But the ground never held it. By the 7th day, he found Lobo Canyon. It was quiet, too quiet. The sort of quiet that settled before death. Dust dismounted a half-mile out, hid the horse in the rocks, moved in slow, rifle across his back, knife in hand. The canyon widened into a pit, rimmed with scrub and ash trees. At the center, the remains of an old silver mine, collapsed shaft, rusted winch, a stone bunker used now for shelter. There were 3 men. One leaned against a rock, smoking. Another cleaned a rifle. The third, scar under the ear, paced nervously. Dust watched them for nearly an hour, learning their rhythms, counting their weapons, waiting for mistakes. When the wind shifted, he moved. He found a nest of rattlesnakes under a stone near the ridge, coaxed one into a burlap sack, carried it quiet as breath down the slope, tossed it into the bunker. The screaming started quick. While they were distracted, Dust lit a soaked tumbleweed and rolled it toward the entrance. Flames bloomed. Scar bolted. Dust tackled him before he reached the edge. Blade pressed to his throat. The man fought hard, but Dust pinned him with a knee and whispered low, "Where's the girl?" "She's with Kane. He's headed to Rio Frio. Said he'd cross by dusk, trade her for gold." Dust drove the hilt of his knife into the man's skull. Not a killing blow. Just sleep. He searched the bodies, took maps, ammo, food, poured out their water, then burned the camp clean. Before leaving, he stood at the mine's mouth and looked down into the black. "You're gonna pay, Kane," he said aloud, voice cold as morning frost. He turned south, toward the borderlands, toward the place where Law went to die. Rosa was still alive, and Kane had just run out of time. The sun bled into the horizon like a wounded thing, staining the sky above the Rio Frio borderlands in streaks of red and gold. Dust lay flat on his stomach atop a limestone ledge overlooking the valley, his chest pressed against warm stone, the breeze lifting strands of ash-colored hair from his brow. Below, nestled between jagged canyon walls, was the Devil's Camp. That's what he'd come to call it. 15 riders, 15 devils. The crows had set up tight. Wagons formed a rough circle, their canvas tarps faded and patched, iron rims sunk deep into the sand. Torches blazed at every corner of the camp, throwing long, flickering shadows over bedrolls, saddlebags, crates of ammunition, and barrels of stolen goods. And people. There were 3 women tied to one of the wagons, hands bound, gags looped behind their heads. One of them wore a torn red shawl around her shoulders. Rosa. Dust's jaw clenched so hard it ached. She was alive. That was enough. For now. Kane paced near the center fire, a bottle in one hand, barking orders to the man and laughing too loud. He moved with swagger, sure of his ground. His black duster caught the firelight as he turned. Dust didn't blink. He watched, silent and still, the way only a man trained by the land itself could watch. He memorized every torch placement, every guard's path, every weak spot in their circle. He watched the water barrels, the tethered horses, the way the wind curled into the camp from the eastern edge. And he remembered. He remembered the boy with no eyes, the woman by the fence, the burning house, the scream that had turned into silence. He waited until full dark, when the torches burned low and the sentries leaned into their boredom. Then he moved. He came down the western slope like smoke, silent, shifting, uncatchable. He wore the desert like a second skin. At the riverbank, he crushed cactus pulp into a thick, chalky liquid, filled a canteen, and poured it into their water supply 1 barrel at a time. Not enough to kill, just enough to blind. He'd learned that trick from a Yaqui tracker in the hills outside Tucson. Next, he took the bottles of lamp oil and soaked bundles of tumbleweed, wrapping them with strips of old canvas. He placed them upwind, near the horses. 1 match would light them all. Finally, he cut the horses loose, just enough so they wouldn't bolt yet, but would scatter the second fear reached them. He became a phantom, a legend before the story had even finished writing itself. It began with a scream. One of the guards staggered from a tent, clutching his face, eyes foaming, stumbling into the fire. Another rushed to help and caught a blade under the ribs. Dust dragged the body into the dark, vanished before the second could fall. Then the fires came. The tumbleweeds lit fast, smoke curling black and thick through the canyon. Horses screamed and tore loose, stampeding into the camp, crushing a man beneath iron hooves. Panic took hold. Kane shouted orders, but his voice was drowned in the chaos. Men fired blindly into the night, bullets ricocheting off rocks. Dust moved among them like a ghost, striking, disappearing, reappearing. He used the dark, the smoke, the confusion. A shot to the knee here. A throat slit there. A shove into the fire pit when no one was looking. The crows started to break. One tried to flee and took a knife in the back. Another turned and fired wildly, hitting his own partner in the gut. Kane, eyes wide now, gnashed his teeth and drew his revolver. "It's him," he shouted. "It's McCrae. He's alive." A man near him shook his head wild-eyed. "You said he was dead, retired." Kane shot him in the chest without a second thought. Rosa used the moment. As Kane turned to reload, she kicked the man beside her in the knee, sent him sprawling. She headbutted him, rolled away, hands still bound. She scrambled toward the canyon edge. Dust met her halfway. He cut the ropes, gripped her face in both hands. She looked at him through smoke and tears, touched his cheek, like she couldn't believe he was real. "Go," he said. "Take the river south. Ride hard. Don't look back." She kissed him once, fierce and fast, and ran. Dust turned back to the fire. Kane stood at the center of the chaos, gun drawn, smoke curling around him like a demon's robe. "McCrae," he bellowed. "Come out, damn you. You want me. Here I am." Dust stepped into the torchlight, rifle slung, revolver loose at his hip, face blackened with soot. His eyes burned like the fire that surrounded them. Kane blinked. "You ain't even a man anymore." Dust stopped 10 paces away. "No," he said softly. "I'm the judgment they left out of the Bible." Kane raised his gun. Dust shot head first, right between the eyes. Kane dropped like a felled tree, his pistol still cocked in his hand. The fire cracked. Ash blew sideways. The last of the crows fell silent. Dust stood there for a long while, the revolver smoking in his hand, the night broken only by the soft hiss of dying flames. Then, as dawn began to streak the sky with pale blue, he turned and walked away. Smoke still curled from the canyon long after the last shot rang out. When the dawn settled over the Rio Frio like pale linen, it lit the camp in hues of red and gold. Beautiful, if you didn't look too close. Bodies lay sprawled like broken marionettes among the ashes. Horses wandered free, gear slapping loose at their flanks. The fire had died, but the heat lingered. Rosa stood near the river, wrapped in a blanket Dust had found in one of the wagons. Her hair was tangled, her lip cut, but her eyes, those deep, defiant eyes, were still burning. Dust said little. He freed the other captives, cutting ropes with the same knife he'd used to mark the crows. They wept, some in silence, others loud and angry. One woman kissed his hand. Another couldn't even look at him. He dug graves with the back edge of a rusted shovel. For the crows, there were no markers. For the women who hadn't survived, he carved crosses from fence posts and pressed wildflowers into the earth. He didn't speak to Rosa again until they were a mile clear of that canyon. "You saved me," she said softly, riding beside him. "No," he replied. "Just made sure they didn't win." Bitter Mesa heard the story before Dust, and Rosa even reached town. The telegraph man had caught wind of it from a survivor who limped into the outpost 3 hours ahead of them. By the time Dust walked into the saloon, every eye turned toward him, not in judgment, but in awe. No one raised a glass. No one asked questions. The sheriff tipped his hat and stepped aside as Dust passed. In the silence, the only sound was Rosa's boots brushing the wooden floorboards. They got what they needed, supplies, a few blankets, nails, and left. No one dared say he'd gone too far. The house at Dry Rock Hollow was gone. Nothing but black stumps and a collapsed well remained. But Dust stood on that scorched earth beside Rosa and looked out across the hills, like a man returning from war. The peach trees were all burned. The barn had caved in. Rosa reached for his hand. "We could start again," she said. "Yeah," Dust murmured. "Or just sit still for a while." She smiled, and it felt like sunrise. They built slow. A new shack, smaller than the first. A stone chimney. Dust carved each board himself, planted new trees when the rains came, and dug a fresh well where the old one had run dry. They never moved far from that patch of land, and no outlaw ever came near again. Years passed. One autumn, long after the buzzards had forgotten Kane's name, A wandering traveler rode through Bitter Mesa. He'd heard talk, rumors, mostly, about a man who burned a gang to the ground over one woman. Said the man had been a ranger, or a killer, or something stranger than both. He found the old homestead late in the day. The place was weathered, quiet. No fences, just wind and sun and the slow creak of a rocking chair on a wooden porch. An old man sat there, lean as a post, gray as desert stone, shotgun resting across his knees. His eyes were pale and calm. The traveler took off his hat. "You dust McCrae?" he asked. The man didn't answer right away, just stared out across the land like he was looking through time. "Was it true," the traveler pressed, "what they say, that you burned 'em all for one woman?" The old man nodded once. "They tried to take my wife," he said, voice dry as gravel. "So I took everything they ever had." The traveler stood there a moment longer, unsure what to say. Then the old man spoke again, quieter this time. "You tell folks that part. Not the blood, not the fire, just that. Let it be enough." He looked out toward the peach trees, now tall and heavy with fruit, and said no more. And that's why they still say, in the Badlands where justice wears no badge, never cross a quiet man with a reason to burn.